Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Against the Odds. So last week on our Against Odds poll, it was Force of Savagery in Modern coming out a huge winner. Everyone wanted to see Force of Savagery. So this week we are heading to Modern to try to make a 0-8 work in a really competitive format. So, I don't know how this one's going to go, but we will give it a shot. A quick reminder before we break down the Force of Savagery deck: if you enjoy Against the Odds and all the other video content here on the channel, it would be awesome if you took a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment. All that stuff is super helpful. Anyway, let's talk about Force of Savagery. So, there's one thing that Force of Savagery does better than any other creature in the entire game of Magic. Unfortunately for us, that one thing is it dies really well. As you can see, it is 3 mana, it has trample, and it has 8 power, which seems absolutely insane, right? 8 power for 3 mana. The problem is it has 0 toughness. So if you cast a Force of Savagery, it literally just dies. It immediately goes to the graveyard. So there's a couple of ways to build a Force of Savagery deck. Option 1 would be to play a bunch of Anthem effects, so that way your Force of Savagery would technically stay alive if you have a Glorious Anthem on the battlefield. Then Force of Savagery would be a 9/1, because Glorious Anthem would be giving it +1/+1, and it wouldn't die as soon as it enters the battlefield. The problem with that plan is a 9/1 still isn't that exciting. Force of Savagery, even if we did go that route and kept it alive with Anthems, it dies to Lightning Bolt because it's going to have 1 toughness most likely. It dies to Abrupt Decay because it's 3 converted mana cost, so it would just die to everything. It would die from getting chumped by a Lingering Souls token. Like, it would get in some damage, but it would still die. So I crossed that one off the list pretty quickly and decided to, instead of trying to build a deck that would eliminate the 0 toughness problem, build a deck that maybe would take advantage of the fact that it's pretty easy to get a Force of Savagery in the graveyard. I mean, unlike another creature, almost every other creature, if you cast it, you actually gotta wait for something to happen for it to die. Force of Savagery, you just cast it and it automatically dies. So maybe we could build a deck where having 0 toughness was actually a benefit rather than being a drawback. So, along with our Force of Savagery, we also have Hunted Horror. So, Hunted Horror doesn't just die when it enters the battlefield. It might kill us because it gives our opponent 2 3/3 green Censure tokens with protection from black, which is the color of Hunted Horror. But you might see the theme here. It is another really high power creature with a low converted mana cost. So what our plan is with our Force of Savagery deck is to get our Force of Savagery and our Hunted Horror in the graveyard, and then use Varel's the Scar Striped to scavenge them onto other creatures and make our other creatures really huge and win the game. So Varel's a 3 mana 2/2, but it says each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost. Scavenge is an ability where you can exile a creature from your graveyard, and then you put a number of counters equal to that creature's power onto a target creature. So, Varel's grants every creature in our graveyard scavenge. So, if we have a Force of Savagery in our graveyard, and a Varel's on the battlefield, we can play 3 mana and put 8 +1/+1 counters on any of our creatures. If we have a Hunted Horror, we can pay 2 mana, get 7 +1/+1 counters on our creatures. So we can make our creatures really huge. And the problem with Varel's is you need a way to get those cards in your graveyard. Well, that's where Force of Savagery comes in, because we can just spend 3 mana, cast our Force of Savagery, it dies, and then we can spend 3 more mana to scavenge it onto another creature. Of course, we can't rely 100% on getting our creatures into the graveyard by casting them and having them die. That works with Force of Savagery, but even then it's slightly slow, and we gotta get our Haunted Horror in the graveyard. We never want to cast a Haunted Horror, because if we give our opponent those tokens, they're gonna kill us. So we're also playing Lotless Troll and Pack Rat. They're pretty sweet because they're on curve with Thralls, so we can play these on turn 2. We can use them on turn 2 with Lotless Troll or on turn 3 with Pack Rat to discard a card from our hand, which could be our Haunted Horror, could be our Force of Savagery if we're trying to kind of combo off a little bit quicker. And then we play our Thralls, start scavenging onto things. They're also just decent cards. We can scavenge onto our Lotless Troll. If we scavenge a Force of Savagery onto a Lotless Troll, we'll have a 10-9 trampling regenerator for only 2 mana. Pack Rat, on the other hand, can just win some games on its own. If you play it on turn 2 and it lives, and you discard a card and make another Pack Rat, and it lives, and you discard a card and make another Pack Rat, opponent really needs some sort of Wrath effect, or you can just Pack Rat them out of the game. So, what are we putting our counters on? Well, we got a little hexproof creature package here. So we got Solana Ledgewalker, 1/1 for 2 with hexproof, and it's almost unblockable. I thought about going with Invisible Stalker here, but I decided I didn't want to splash blue. We're splashing another color for a sweet sideboard card we'll talk about in a minute. So I went with Solana Ledgewalker, which is pretty much an Invisible Stalker. Not 100% unblockable, but pretty close to unblockable. Unblockable by ground creatures. Then we also have some trolls. Troll Aesthetic, run the last troll. They have hexproof, they can regenerate. So these are the creatures that we want to scavenge our Force of Savagery, our Haunted Horror onto. When we make these things huge, Solana Ledgewalker is just going to be unblockable a lot of the time and kill our opponent really quick. Meanwhile, Troll, either of the trolls, turn into the Abyss essentially, where our opponent's just going to have to throw a creature in front of them every turn. We're going to eat through their board and eventually hit them for lethal. We also have a way to potentially win really fast in 4 Inkmoth Nexus. So Inkmoth Nexus, the idea with this one is it already has 1 power. So if we can get in 1 hit with the Inkmoth Nexus early in the game, no one really worries about the first hit of Inkmoth, especially from a non-infect deck. Then on turn 5 or something, we can potentially activate our Inkmoth, have our Thralls out, scavenge those Force of Savagery counters onto our Inkmoth Nexus, get it all the way up to 9 power, and kill our opponent in just 1 hit. So it's not quite a one-shot kill. We got to get in 1 infect damage before that, but it's basically the equivalent of hitting for 18 damage if we can scavenge the Force of Savagery onto the Inkmoth and get in an attack. So this is kind of our way to steal wins when everything else is going poorly. We always have the possibility of just putting a ton of counters on an Inkmoth and killing our opponent with Infect. And then the rest of the deck, typical stuff, a little bit of discard to disrupt our opponent, protect our Thralls and our other creatures, a bit of removal in Abrupt Decay and Maelstrom Pulse, a Painful Truce. Mana base wise, apart from the Inkmoth Nexi, we have some fetch lands, we have some shock lands, and as you can see, every card in our main deck is green and black, but we have some white mana that we can fetch up, and you're going to see why as soon as we get to the sideboard. You might be able to guess already. A Hissing Quagmire, Forest, Swamps in the sideboard. One of my favorite cards. So since we are playing these hexproof creatures, and since it's pretty easy to splash a color in Modern, thanks to fetch lands and shock lands, we got some worships. So this is kind of our out of the sideboard surprise way to win the game. If we can get a troll or a ledgewalker on the battlefield and stick a worship, it's pretty close to saying we can't die until our opponent either finds a way to kill a hexproof regenerator, which is usually pretty challenging. You need like a Damnation, maybe a Liliana if we don't have any more creatures, but there's not a lot of ways to do it. Or you need to kill a worship, which is possible. Dramoka's Command, some targeted enchantment removal like Wear Tear, but still it's 4 mana, dodges Abrupt Decay. A lot of the common stuff doesn't hit it, so this is kind of a way we can potentially steal some wins out of the sideboard from an unsuspecting opponent. The rest of the sideboard, some Graveyard Hate in Surgical Extraction and Nile Spellbomb. Scavenging Ooze, also Graveyard Hate, gains us some life as well. Fulminator Mage to kill some lands against Tron, maybe some Celestial Colonnades against Jeskai. Some more discard, another Painful Truce, and then some more removal, just so we can kind of customize our removal package. So that's our Force of Savagery deck. I think it looks pretty sweet, considering the limitations of Force of Savagery and how hard it is to actually make a zero toughness creature work. I think this is the best way of doing it. And I could imagine that we do some pretty powerful things. Like if we just happen to get our Force of Savagery in the graveyard and scavenge it onto any of our big hexproof creatures or an Inkmoth Nexus, I think we can close out some games pretty quick. And our deck is fairly efficient. Some of our against odds decks were playing these really big expensive spells, and we gotta kind of hope our opponent's deck is super slow. Well, we got a fairly decent curve. We got some 2-drops, we got some 3-drops, we got some decent removal and disruption, so it actually looks like a fairly realistic modern deck. So I'm hopeful that this one's actually gonna work. The biggest risk is we just don't draw our Virals. If we don't have overalls, then Force of Savagery does literal nothing, and our Haunted Horde does literal nothing as well. So we really want to not only draw overalls, but be able to protect it long enough to at least scavenge a Force of Savagery one time onto something. If we can do that, I think we're pretty favored to win a lot of games. If we can't do that, then it might be it might be a rough match. So we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to be fun and interesting to play. I really like Virals, and Force of Savagery might be the best thing in Modern to scavenge, just because the power and toughness is so high, and it's so easy to get into the graveyard compared to pretty much everything else. So I'm going to say that we win, let's say 40% of the time. I'm going to go optimistic on this one. So 2 out of every 5 games, might even win some matches. I think we got a shot with this one, but we'll see. Anyway, that's our Force of Savagery deck for Against the Odds. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the games, and I will talk to you soon.